beginning with a wartime novel, Put Out More Flags, by Evelyn Waugh. Basil Seal is about to billet some awful Birmingham evacuees on an unsuspecting couple. "Jesus," said Doris, "you aren't going to leave us here." The low winter sun cast Basil's shadow before him, ominously against the door, which Mr. Harkness had painted apple green. Presently, it was opened by a maid, also dressed in apple green, with an apron of sprigged muslin and a starched white cap that was, in effect, part Dutch, part conventual, and wholly ludicrous. This figure of fancy led Basil up a step, down a step, and into a living room, where he was left long enough to observe the decorations. The floor was covered in coarse rush matting, and in places by bright Balkan rugs. The most prominent objects of furniture were a grand piano and a harp. From an open hearth, peat smoke billowed periodically into the room, causing Basil's eyes to water. It was just such a room as Basil had imagined from the advertisement, and Mr. and Mrs. Harkness were just such a couple. Mrs. Harkness wore a hand-woven woolen garment. Her eyes were large and poetic. Her nose was long and red with the frost. Her hair nondescript in colour and haphazard in arrangement. Her husband had done all that a man can to disguise the effect of 20 years of club and bungalow life in the Far East. He'd grown a little pointed beard. He wore a homespun suit of knickerbockers in the style of the pioneers of bicycling. He wore a cameo ring round his loose silk tie. And yet, there was something in his bearing which still suggested the dapper figure in white ducks who had stood his round of pink gins, evening after evening, to other dapper white figures, and had dined twice a year at Government House. "My name is Seal. I came about your advertisement in the Courier." "Our advertisement? Ah, yes," said Mr. Harkness vaguely. "It was just an idea we had. We felt a little ashamed here with so much space and beauty. The place is a little large for our requirements these days. We did think that perhaps if we heard of a few people like ourselves, the same simple tastes, we might join forces, as it were, during the present difficult times." "It was just an idle thought," said Mrs. Harkness. "A green thought in a green place." "This is not a guest house, you know. We take in paying guests, quite a different thing." Basil understood their difficulties with a keenness of perception that was rare to him. "It's not for myself that I was inquiring," he said. "Oh, that's different. I dare say we might take in one or two more if they were really..." Mrs. Harkness helped him out. "If we were sure they were the kind of people who would be happy here." "Exactly. It's essentially a happy house." It was like his housemaster at school. "We're essentially a keen house, Seal. We may not win many cups, but at least we try." "Are your friends who are thinking of coming here artistic people?" "No, I don't think you could call them that." "They don't write?" "No, I don't think so." "I've always thought this would be an ideal place for someone who wanted to write. May I ask, what are your friends?" "Well, I suppose you might call them evacuees." Mr. and Mrs. Harkness laughed pleasantly at the little joke. "Townsfolk in search of sanctuary, eh?" "Exactly." "Well, they'll find it here, eh, Agnes?" They were back in the living room. Mrs. Harkness laid her hand on the gilded neck of the harp and looked out across the sunken garden with a dreamy look in her large grey eyes. Thus she had looked out across the Malaya golf course, dreaming of home. "I like to think of this beautiful old house still being of use in the world. After all, it was built for use. Hundreds of years ago it gave bread to the people. Then, with the change of the times, it was left forlorn and derelict. And now at last it comes into its own again, fulfilling a need. You may think me fanciful," she said, remote and whimsical, "but in the last few weeks I feel sometimes I can see the old house smiling to itself and hear the old timbers whispering, 'They thought we were no use. They thought we were old stick-in-the-muds. But they can't get on without us, all these busy, go-ahead people. They come back to us when they're in trouble.'" "Agnes was always a poet," said Mr. Harkness. "I've had to be the practical housewife. You saw our terms in the advertisement." "Yes." "They may have seemed to you a little heavy, but you must understand that our guests live exactly as we do ourselves. We live simply, but we like our comforts. Fires, he said, backing slightly from the belch of aromatic smoke which issued into the room as he spoke. The garden, he said, indicating the frozen and buried enclosure outside the windows. In the summer, we take our meals under the old mulberry tree. Music, every week we have chamber music. There are certain imponderabilia at the old mill which, to be crude, have their market value. I don't think, he said coyly, I don't think that in the circumstances, and the circumstances Basil felt sure were meant to include a large